A millionaire forced his daughter to marry the humble gardener to punish her. However, he was stunned by what she did. In his grand office, Franklin Parker sat silently, a sweeping view of the Wind Valley churchyard stretching endlessly before him. The golden glow of the late afternoon cast a warm light over the hills, but Franklin's mind was miles away, clouded by frustration. His daughter, Sophia, had overstepped her boundaries once again. The private investigator's report lay open on his desk, each line a testament to her latest act of rebellion. Sophia had entangled herself with some irresponsible youth from Los Angeles, a brash young man who seemed to attract trouble. Franklin's jaw clenched in anger. He had poured every resource into her life: money, prestigious education, endless opportunities, and yet, this was how she chose to repay him. He had tried to reason with her, but Sophia, headstrong and independent, constantly defied his rules. Ever since her mother's passing, Franklin had taken it upon himself to control every facet of her life, convinced it was the only way to keep her safe from the harshness of the world beyond their luxurious estate. But now his grip on her seemed to be slipping. This was no longer about a man, it was about discipline and respect. He refused to let Sophia squander her future on a reckless romance with someone who offered her no future. Franklin needed to show her the consequences of defiance, a lesson so lasting that she wouldn't dare repeat her mistakes. An idea, dark and severe, began to take shape in his mind. Picking up the phone, he dialed a number he knew by heart. "Albert, could you come by the office? We need to talk," he said firmly when the line connected. Albert, the faithful gardener of their estate, was as reliable as the sunrise. For years, he had tended the churchyard and gardens with a quiet dedication. A humble man, Albert asked for little, just a fair wage and the satisfaction of a day's hard work. But today, Albert was about to be drawn into Franklin's web of control. Minutes later, Albert knocked on the door, respectfully stepping in and removing his cap. "Mr. Parker, you wanted to see me." His voice was steady, but a hint of apprehension showed in his eyes. Franklin took a moment to study the man before him. Albert was in his early 30s, rugged from years of outdoor labor, with a quiet presence that exuded calm. He embodied everything Sophia disdained: modesty, simplicity, a lack of ambition for material wealth. But to Franklin, these were exactly the qualities he needed for his plan. "Yes, Albert, I have a proposal for you," Franklin began, leaning back in his leather chair. "It involves my daughter, Sophia." Albert's brow furrowed in confusion. "Sophia?" Franklin nodded, his gaze turning sharp and cold. "I'm sure you've noticed her behavior. She's been reckless, irresponsible, and determined to ruin her future. I can't stand by and let that happen." Albert remained silent, the frown deepening on his face. Like everyone on the estate, he knew Sophia. She was stunning, intelligent, and headstrong, the kind of woman unafraid to voice her discontent. "I want her to understand responsibility, Albert. To learn that life isn't about indulgence or rebellion," Franklin continued. "So I've decided she will marry you." The air grew heavy, and for a moment, Albert looked as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Marry me," he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Yes," Franklin replied. "You're diligent, reliable, grounded. Everything Sophia needs to see up close. She'll finally understand what life is like for those who earn their keep. And for you," Franklin added, his tone softening, "there will be financial rewards." Albert stared, expression unreadable. "Sir, I'm just the gardener. Sophia, she doesn't care for me. This doesn't feel right." Franklin waved a dismissive hand. "This isn't about feelings, Albert, it's about teaching her a lesson. You'd be doing her a long-term favor. She needs to grow up, and you can help her do that." Silence settled thickly between them, Franklin's words hanging ominously in the air. Albert shifted uncomfortably, casting a glance out the window toward the churchyard, as if the vines might somehow offer escape from this proposition. I don't know, Mr. Parker," Albert began, but Franklin cut him off with a cold finality. "This isn't a choice, Albert. Neither of you have one." Albert lowered his gaze, sensing any protest would be futile. Franklin Parker had made his decision, and there was no undoing it. Later that night, Sophia returned to the stars after a day in the city, her heels echoing against the marble floors, unaware of the storm brewing within its walls. Franklin waited for her in the drawing room, his presence one of cold authority. "Sophia," he called as she passed by. She sighed, irritation flashing in her eyes. "What now, Dad?" "I don't need another one of your lectures." Franklin stood, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "There won't be any more lectures, Sophia. You've made your choices, and now you'll deal with the consequences." Her eyebrows rose as she folded her arms, defiant. "What are you talking about? You're getting married," Franklin declared, his voice calm but unmistakably resolute. Sophia froze, shock washing over her. "Married? To who?" "To Albert, the gardener." Franklin's gaze never wavered from hers. In an instant, Sophia's shock turned to rage. What? Are you insane? You can't be serious. Franklin's tone grew steely. Oh, I'm very serious, Sophia. In 2 days, you'll marry Albert, and maybe then you'll understand what it's like to live in the real world. The following days passed in a blur of disbelief and fury for Sophia. She tried everything to change his mind, pleading, yelling, even threatening to disappear. But her father remained firm, unyielding. Franklin Parker was a man used to control, and this marriage was simply another means of asserting his dominance over her life. Standing before the mirror in her room at Athena House, Sophia stared at her reflection in a simple white dress, a far cry from the grand gown she'd once dreamed of. Her hair was carefully pinned up, but there was no trace of excitement, no glimmer of joy. Only a hollow emptiness filled her heart. She shook her head, whispering to her reflection, I can't believe this is really happening. Her own gaze met hers, unreadable and cold, mirroring the weight of a choice that had never truly been hers. This act of defiance, a forced marriage, a life redefined, was Franklin's attempt to control her once more, but he was about to be more surprised than he could ever imagine. Outside, the morning sun radiated brightly, casting a gentle warmth over the expansive gardens of the stars, the Parker family estate. For Sophia, however, the sunlight may as well have been a distant memory, its warmth unable to penetrate the icy reality she faced. She felt confined, ensnared in a life that no longer felt like her own, pushed into a marriage she had never chosen. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Of course, it was her father, coming to ensure she hadn't tried to escape or change her mind. Sophia, Franklin's tone was firm as he entered. It's time. She turned to him, her eyes flashing with defiance. You know this is wrong, don't you? Franklin's gaze didn't falter. It's for your own good, Sophia. In time, you'll come to understand. She clenched her fists, her resolve mixed with bitterness. Resistance was pointless now. She would go through with it, but she promised herself she'd make him regret this. Following him downstairs into the chardyard garden, where a modest gathering awaited, her mind raced. The weight of the life she was about to enter pressed down on her, a life bound to Albert, a man she barely knew and certainly didn't love. It was humiliating, yet it was happening, and there was no turning back. Albert stood quietly by the floral archway, looking just as out of place as she felt. He was dressed in a plain suit, his rugged features softened by the occasion's formal setting. Yet, despite his unease, a calm acceptance lingered in his expression, something that only frustrated Sophia more. How could he just comply so passively? The officiant waited, smiling as if this were a joyous occasion, and Sophia suppressed an urge to roll her eyes. There was no joy here. Her mind drifted, fixated on thoughts of escape. Anything to avoid the life being forced upon her. Albert's steady voice interrupted her reverie as he spoke his vows. He looked at her directly, and for an instant Sophia saw something surprising in his eyes, an unspoken acknowledgement of their shared predicament. He wasn't happy about this either, naturally. He hadn't asked for this any more than she had, but here he was, fulfilling his role as much as she was. When her turn came, the words tasted bitter on her tongue. I do, she whispered, the phrase barely audible. And with those words it was done. She was now Mrs. Albert, whoever he truly was. She realized she hadn't even asked. As the brief ceremony concluded, the few onlookers clapped politely, but there was no warmth, no joy. This was merely an agreement, a contract, nothing more. Sophia cast a hard glare toward her father, who stood with arms crossed, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. She wanted to scream, to tell him he'd stolen her life, but she managed only a cold, wordless glare. Albert approached, extending his arm. An uncomfortable gesture of tradition. Sophia hesitated before accepting, the touch feeling distant and hollow. They walked back toward Athena House in silence, neither able to find the words. Once inside, Franklin immediately set the terms. You'll live in Athena House, he said, his tone all business. It's modest but will serve your needs. Sophia shot him a withering look. Of course it's modest. That's exactly the point, isn't it? Franklin ignored her scorn. You'll share this space as husband and wife. It's time you learned what life really entails. Sophia, she wanted to argue, to fight back, but the day's events had drained her completely. Resigned, she nodded silently, accepting her fate. Albert, quiet throughout, maintained a neutral expression. Sophia couldn't read his thoughts, and frankly, she didn't care. She just wanted solitude. Without another word, she turned and made her way to Athena House, leaving Albert and her father behind. The small house, while modest compared to the stars, was still larger than anything she had known outside her family's opulent world. She crossed the threshold, and the reality of her situation settled in fully. This was her new life? No luxury, no freedom? She was now tethered to Albert in this confined space, which felt as imprisoning as any cage. A few moments later, Albert quietly entered, closing the door behind him. "I'm sorry, Sophia," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Sophia whirled around, anger flashing in her eyes. "What I wanted. None of this was my choice." She took a steadying breath, tamping down the resentment bubbling within. "But I guess that doesn't matter now, does it? We're both trapped." Albert's gaze lowered, his face somber. "I suppose so." They stood in silence, their union a weight neither wanted but now shared. Sophia knew, despite any resolve, that life would never be the same. The next morning, Sophia woke, a familiar heaviness settling over her. Athena House, with its simple decor and cozy atmosphere, bore no resemblance to the lavish rooms she had once known. No silk sheets, no grand windows, only plain curtains and a small, creaky bed. She lay there, staring up at the ceiling, wishing this were a nightmare from which she might awaken. But the sound of dishes clattering in the kitchen brought her back to harsh reality. This was real. She was married to Albert, the gardener, and there was no escaping it. Sighing, she threw off the covers and shuffled to the bathroom. The cold water splashed on her face, and she caught her own weary reflection. Her hair was a mess, her eyes red and puffy from lack of sleep. The confident, carefree woman she once knew was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized, a stranger imprisoned in a life not of her choosing. Emerging from the bedroom, she found Albert already at the small kitchen table, quietly sipping coffee. He looked up, a tentative smile on his face. "Good morning," he greeted softly. She ignored him, reaching for a bottle of water from the fridge. She wasn't in the mood for politeness, especially not with the man who was now technically her husband. No matter how gentle Albert appeared, she couldn't forget the circumstances, nor would she make things easy. "You should eat something," he offered, his voice calm but persistent. "I made eggs." She glanced briefly at the scrambled eggs on the table. They looked decent, but her appetite was non-existent. Taking a long sip of water, she placed the bottle down with a loud thud. "I'm not hungry," she replied flatly. Albert nodded, his expression unreadable, returning to his coffee. The silence stretched, awkward and heavy, as the tension between them lingered like an invisible fog. Sophia felt his gaze on her, but she refused to meet his eyes. She needed air, an escape from the suffocating tension filling the house. Grabbing her jacket from the hook by the door, she stepped outside, letting the door slam shut behind her. The fresh morning air hit her face, offering a fleeting moment of relief, but it wasn't enough to ease the frustration building within. Athena House sat on the edge of the sprawling charred yard, the grapevines stretching endlessly across the estate's boundaries. The soft morning sun cast a golden glow over the meticulously arranged rows, with mountains rising in the distance, majestic yet indifferent. It should have been breathtaking, serene even, but Sophia felt none of it. She began walking, her strides quick and deliberate, as if distance could somehow quiet the storm raging inside her. She didn't know where she was headed, nor did she care. She only knew she couldn't remain in that house any longer, surrounded by Albert and the harsh truth of her new life. As she wandered through the charred yard, flashes of her old life flooded Sophia's mind, browsing shops on Rodeo Drive, lavish dinners with friends, jet-setting to private islands. Everything she had once taken for granted now felt impossibly far away. Her father had stripped it all from her with this so-called punishment, leaving her stranded in what felt like a waking nightmare. Frustration bubbled up as she kicked at the dirt, sending small stones skittering into the vines. "This is so ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. "I don't belong here. I shouldn't be stuck with him." She kept walking, letting the charred yard envelop her, rows of green and gold stretching on like an endless maze. But as the sun climbed higher, she knew she couldn't put off the inevitable forever. Eventually, she would have to return to Athena House. Albert would still be there, quiet and unbothered, waiting for her to acknowledge him. His calm acceptance infuriated her. How could he simply accept this situation without protest? By the time she reached Athena House, the kitchen was empty. Albert had cleaned up from breakfast and disappeared, likely out working in the garden. A pang of guilt flickered in her mind, knowing he'd tried to be considerate. But she brushed it away. Kindness wasn't the issue here. Her entire life had been turned upside down, and no gesture, not even scrambled eggs, would change that. She drifted into the living room and collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. Time seemed to slow, each hour stretching as Sophia wrestled with the question of what to do now. There were no parties to attend, no shopping sprees to plan. Her days of indulgence were gone, likely for the foreseeable future. As evening began to settle, she heard the door creak open and Albert stepped inside, his face flushed and dusted with remnants of a day's work. Wiping the sweat from his brow, he glanced at her, his gaze searching for something. "I'm making dinner," he said after a pause. "You're welcome to join me." Sophia didn't respond, simply crossing her arms and staring ahead. Albert waited, then turned quietly to the kitchen. The gentle clatter of pots and pans broke the silence, and for a fleeting moment, she considered slipping out, just to escape the tension. Yet something kept her rooted, something she couldn't quite name. Sitting there, listening to the familiar sounds of cooking, Sophia came to a realization: Albert wasn't resisting her anger. He wasn't responding with frustration or resentment. Instead, he seemed to be giving her space, allowing her to process things in her own way. It was both maddening and, in some strange way, oddly reassuring. The next morning, Sophia awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, a stark contrast to the constant hum of city life she was used to. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was, until reality swept over her, heavy as ever. She was still at Athena House, still bound in this forced marriage with Albert. Nothing had changed. Sighing, she sat up, running her hands through her tangled hair. Through the small window, she saw Albert already working in the garden, carefully tending to a patch of flowers, his focus unwavering. Even from a distance, she could see the concentration etched into his features, as if the entire world faded away when he was at work. Sophia walked over to the window and watched him for a moment. She'd never understood people like Albert, those who found contentment in simplicity. To her, life was all about speed, luxury hotels, and exclusivity. Yet, for Albert, it seemed that a day spent outdoors working with his hands was enough. It didn't make sense to her, yet there was a small part of her that felt a spark of curiosity. What was it like to live in a world unhurried, with a rhythm dictated by nature, a world where fulfillment came from the soil itself and one's labor? Shaking her head, Sophia turned from the window, resolving to simply get through her morning. She wasn't interested in understanding Albert or his way of life, she was just biding her time, waiting for the chance to reclaim her real life. But the days dragged on, and that chance felt nowhere in sight. That afternoon, Sophia found herself walking aimlessly across the estate, her steps bringing her closer to the garden where Albert was working. She hadn't planned to speak to him, but something about his presence among the plants, moving with a quiet grace, piqued her interest. She lingered at the edge of the garden, watching as he moved from one flower bed to the next, his hands skillfully pruning and shaping the greenery. Albert worked with a focus she hadn't seen before, different from the relentless ambition that had fueled her father's world of business deals and high-stakes negotiations. This was slower, more intentional, and strangely serene. Watching him, Sophia noticed something unexpected. Albert seemed unhurried, completely absorbed in his work. He didn't rush through the tasks. Each action appeared deliberate, as if he found joy in the process itself, not just the outcome. Every so often, he would pause to wipe his brow or examine a plant more closely, as if the rest of the world faded away. She was surprised to find herself fascinated by his quiet determination. It was calming in a way she couldn't understand, even if she still didn't grasp how anyone could be content with such a simple life. After a while, Albert seemed to sense her presence. He looked up, catching her gaze across the garden. Standing up, he brushed dirt off his hands and offered a small, welcoming smile. "Hey," he greeted as he walked over. "Didn't think you'd be out here." Sophia shrugged, crossing her arms defensively. "There wasn't anything better to do." Albert nodded, glancing back at the garden. "I understand. It's not exactly thrilling around here, but it has its peace." "Peace," Sophia echoed, a touch of mockery in her voice. "Is that really all you want? Just peace?" Albert tilted his head thoughtfully, mulling over her question. "I guess so. I never felt the need for much else." Sophia stared at him, baffled. "You've never wanted more? No ambitions? No grand dreams?" Albert smiled, but his gaze held something deeper, something Sophia couldn't quite pinpoint. "Ambition was never my goal. I like waking up, knowing I'll be doing work I love. There's a kind of joy in watching things grow, knowing you had a part in it." Sophia frowned, struggling to understand how anyone could be content with so little. Yet she realized that Albert wasn't one to chase wealth or status. He was different. "You don't get bored?" she asked, genuinely curious. Albert chuckled softly. "Not really. There's always something to tend to, something to repair or nurture. It's never dull when you appreciate the small things." Sophia didn't reply. She wasn't sure how to process his perspective. The little things had never mattered to her. Life was supposed to be grand, filled with excitement and luxury. But as she stood there, watching Albert's simple satisfaction, she wondered if maybe she'd overlooked something. Not that she was ready to admit it. Good for you, I guess, she muttered, brushing off the thought. But it still seems ridiculous. Albert just smiled, undeterred by her dismissal. You don't have to understand, Sophia. It's just who I am. A long silence settled between them, broken only by the gentle rustling of the chardyard leaves in the breeze. Sophia shifted uneasily, the weight of Albert's words pressing on her like a heavy blanket she couldn't quite shake. You should give it a try sometime, Albert said finally, his tone light, yet sincere. Might surprise you. Sophia scoffed, rolling her eyes. Me? In a garden? Not happening. Albert chuckled softly, giving a small shrug. Suit yourself. He turned back to his work, leaving Sophia standing there, once again watching him. An unfamiliar feeling stirred within her, something between confusion and intrigue. She didn't understand Albert, and a part of her didn't want to. But there was a small, nagging part of her that wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something worth learning from him. She quickly dismissed the thought. She wasn't about to be swayed by the simplicity of Albert's life. She had a world waiting for her, filled with glamour, excitement, and power. This was only a phase, temporary at best. But as she turned to head back to Athena House, Sophia couldn't resist glancing back at Albert one last time, feeling a quiet tug at something deep inside, something she wasn't quite ready to face. Days turned into a steady rhythm at Athena House, and Sophia found herself settling into an odd routine. The resentment she felt toward her father's decree still lingered, but something was changing, despite her best efforts to resist. It started each morning. She would awaken to birdsong and the warm morning sun filtering through the thin curtains of the guest house. At first, she'd lie in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, dreading each day. But gradually, she began noticing the sounds outside, the breeze rustling the leaves, the subtle stir of life just beyond the walls she'd mentally constructed around herself. Albert was always up before her, out in the garden or working around the estate. His steady presence, once an irritation, now brought a strange sense of calm. She kept her distance, of course. She wasn't about to romanticize her life here or imagine a perfect union with the gardener. But she couldn't deny that something had shifted. One morning, standing by the window watching him work, she felt a quiet admiration. Albert moved with a natural grace, his hands carefully tending to each plant, as though he understood them on an unspoken level. There was a rhythm to his work, a confidence that could only come from years of dedication, and despite herself, Sophia couldn't help but respect it. The transformation was subtle, but real. Little by little, she found herself drawn to the world around her, the vibrant colors of the flowers, the warmth of the sun, the gentle sigh of the wind as it swept through the chardyard. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch with a book, Albert approached with a basket of freshly picked vegetables, his shirt stained with the day's labor. Mind if I sit? He asked, nodding at the empty chair beside her. Sophia shrugged, not taking her eyes off her book. Do what you want. Albert smiled faintly and took the seat. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, yet it wasn't quite warm either. It was somewhere in between, familiar yet distant, like the quiet shared with someone you thought you knew but didn't really know at all. I've been thinking, Albert said at last, breaking the silence, about you being here and about how things have been. Sophia glanced up, raising an eyebrow. Oh, really? And what's on your mind? Albert kept his gaze on the basket in his hands, fingers absently toying with a sprig of thyme. I know this isn't what you wanted, I get that. But does it have to be so terrible? Sophia scoffed, her defenses flaring. So terrible? Albert, I'm living in a guest house on my father's land, married to a man I barely know, all because I was forced. You actually think this situation isn't miserable? Albert chuckled softly, shaking his head. I'm not saying it's ideal. But you've been here for a while now. You've seen the way things work here. Maybe it's not what you're used to, but it's not all bad, right? Sophia bit back a sharp retort, but the words stalled in her throat. The truth was, she didn't know how to feel anymore. Albert must have sensed her hesitation because he spoke again. I'm not asking you to like it here. I just think, maybe there's something worth noticing. Something simple, maybe even worthwhile. Sophia rolled her eyes, though her tone lacked its usual edge. Gardening. You think that's what's worth my attention? Albert's smile grew slightly, genuine and unbothered. Perhaps. You'd be surprised. You're welcome to join me anytime. Sophia shook her head, but she couldn't fight the small smile forming on her lips. Yeah, I don't think so. They sat together a while longer, letting the conversation drift as the day softened into dusk. She watched as the sun dipped low, casting long, golden shadows across the chardyard. The light filtered through the leaves, casting a tranquil glow over everything, the air growing quiet as evening settled. For once, Sophia didn't feel an urge to escape. She wasn't clawing to break free or run back to her old life. The anger toward her father lingered, and the frustration over her circumstances hadn't vanished. But deep inside, something was shifting. She was beginning to see things she'd never noticed, the subtle beauty and the simple, and maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to understand. As the sun finally disappeared behind the hills, Sophia stood and stretched. "I'm heading inside," she said, her tone casual. Albert nodded, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "All right, see you around." Walking back to Athena House, she realized her feelings had changed, even if she couldn't pinpoint how. This life wasn't perfect, and she still wasn't sure of her future, but she no longer felt completely adrift. There was something here, something calming, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of that calm came from Albert too. Days drifted by, and life at Athena House settled into a gentle rhythm. Each morning brought birdsong and the soft rustle of the chardyard leaves. Albert's presence, once an irritation, became as familiar as the sunrise, the warmth of a gentle breeze through the fields. Yet, despite the calm around her, Sophia's emotions remained turbulent. She couldn't deny the quiet changes taking hold within. The fierce anger she once nursed was softening, and she resented it. She didn't want to release that fire it had sustained her, given her direction. But now she found herself questioning what she had held on to for so long. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch, legs curled beneath her, gazing out over the chardyard, her thoughts darkened. She despised the lack of clear answers. Once, her anger had been straightforward. She loathed her father, loathed Albert, and loathed this entire situation. But now, in unguarded moments, she felt not happiness, but a measure of peace that unnerved her. Albert worked nearby, and she realized she'd started watching him more often, not romantically, but drawn by something unexplainable. He was steady, grounded, and satisfied with a life she would have once scorned. Despite its modesty, the small life she was now a part of encompassed everything Sophia had once looked down upon. Yet somehow she found herself wondering if there was more to life than the whirlwind she'd been pursuing for so long. Her mind drifted back to a conversation she'd had with Albert a few days ago, when he had gently suggested there might be something worth appreciating here. She had scoffed then, but now maybe he had a point. Perhaps there was something valuable in this slower, simpler way of living, but acknowledging that brought its own set of troubling questions. What would it mean for the life she'd led up to now if she truly found value in simplicity? Had her previous life been empty, defined only by shallow pursuits? Sophia shook her head, as though trying to ward off these uncomfortable thoughts. She wasn't ready to confront those kinds of reflections yet. Her whole identity had been built around wealth, prestige, and the allure of finer things. And here she was, in a modest little place like Athena House, starting to entertain the notion that those things may not hold the significance she once thought they did. Restless, Sophia stepped outside, seeking movement as a way to evade her thoughts. She wandered through the chardyard, trailing her fingers along the leaves as she passed, breathing in the cool air as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting soft shadows over the rows of vines. For the first time, she noticed a beauty here that had eluded her before. Eventually, she reached the edge of the property and saw Albert sitting on a small stone wall, his hands resting quietly in his lap as he gazed out over the chardyard. He looked lost in thought, and for a moment, Sophia hesitated. She wasn't even sure why she had walked this way or why she felt the need to talk to him, but here she was. "Hey," she said gently, taking a step closer. Albert looked up and gave her a small, warm smile. "Hey, everything all right?" She shrugged, unsure how to respond. "I guess I just needed to get out of the house." Albert nodded, shifting over to make space beside him on the wall. "Have a seat," he offered. They sat there in silence, the only sounds being the soft rustle of the chardyard leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. For all the quiet around them, Sophia's mind was anything but still. "I don't get it," she said eventually, breaking the silence. Albert looked over, one eyebrow raised. "What don't you get?" "How you can be so okay with all of this," she said, gesturing at the world around them. "This life, I mean. It's so small. Don't you ever want something bigger?" Albert paused, seeming to consider her words. "Depends on what you mean by bigger." "I mean more," Sophia replied, her voice edged with frustration. "More excitement, more success, more money, more everything. How can you be content with so little?" Albert gave a small smile, his expression thoughtful. For me, it's about what matters. It's not the money or the thrill. It's knowing that I'm building something, watching it grow. That, to me, is everything I need. Sophia shook her head slowly, struggling to understand. But don't you feel like you're missing out on more? Albert chuckled, a soft, knowing sound. Maybe to some folks it would look that way. But I don't feel like I'm missing anything. I think people get so lost chasing after what they don't have, they forget to appreciate what's right there in front of them. His words resonated with Sophia more deeply than she had expected. She had spent her entire life chasing after more wealth, more recognition, more admiration. And now, here she was, beside someone who seemed completely satisfied with so much less. It made her question everything she thought she knew about fulfillment.